Hey class, in today's lesson we're going to talk about samples and surveys, which is found in section 11-7 of your book. Our objective is to identify sampling methods and to recognize bias in samples and surveys. So a population is all the members of a set, and a sample is a part of that population. A sample has a bias when a part of the population is overrepresented or underrepresented. A bias is a systemic error introduced by the sampling method. So there are different types of sampling methods. So a convenience sample would be that a person may select any members of the population who are conveniently and readily available. Self-selected sample, it happens when one selects only members of the population who volunteer for the sample. So it kind of sounds like basically they selected themselves to be a part of it. Systemic sample is it says the order the population in some way and then select from it at regular intervals. And then a random sample is all members of the population are equally likely to be chosen. All right, so in example 1, it says a newspaper wants to find out what percent of the city's population favors a property tax increase to raise money for local parks. What is the sampling method used for each situation? Does the sample have bias? All right, so we're going to think about this on the next slide, but we want to think back over those types of methods. So again, it's convenience, which means that you just select the members of the population who are conveniently and readily available. The self-selected sample is like they come to you pretty much, they volunteer. Systemic means you have selected them in some type of way. And random means anybody is likely to be chosen. All right, so the first type, it says a newspaper article on the tax increase invites readers to call the paper and express their opinions. Being that they invited the readers to call the paper and express their opinions, most likely that is going to be considered self-selected because these people are going to want to call based on how they feel about it. And most likely there is some sort of bias because there's going to be some sort of bias because when normally only people who have a strong opinion about something will actually call. It depends on if those people who call actually have the same views as what they want as far as a tax increase or without it. All right, so then it goes on to say a reporter interviews people leaving the city's largest park. And so that one is considered a convenience sample. Because they basically just conveniently selected them due to that situation. But the deal is, again, there's probably going to be some bias there because most of the people who are leaving actually like parks, right? So if you are asking those particular people, those are park people, so there's going to be a bias because there's overrepresentation of park supporters. And then the last one says a survey service calls every 50th listing from the local phone book. And this one would be considered a systemic sample. And for the most part, there should be no bias there because it's random. All right, so the try. So to survey the eating habits of the community, employees of a local television station interview people visiting a food court in the mall. What sampling method are they using? Does the sample have bias? So in this case, they're using convenience because they're conveniently picking people. And regarding whether it has bias or not, most likely it is biased because those people are actually at a food location, so they already have a preference as to maybe what they want to eat, so there would be some type of bias there. All right, so there are actually study methods now. So before we were talking about the sampling methods, and now there are study methods, so a little different. So it says in an observational study, you measure or observe members of a sample in such a way that you are not affected by that they are not affected by the study. In a controlled experiment, you divide the sample into two groups. You impose a treatment on one group, but not on the other control group. Then you compare the effect on the treated group to the control group. So in that one, you have very much a hands-on. You're manipulating what's going to happen. You're forcing two different, or hoping to force two different sets of results so that you can compare them later. And then the last one, it says in a survey, you ask every member of the sample a set of questions. All right, so now we're going to talk about survey questions. So a poorly written survey question can introduce bias such as combining two or more issues, using double negatives, overlapping answer choices, words that cause strong reactions like a loaded question, and suggesting that you want a particular answer such as a leading question. So we're going to analyze some survey questions, okay? So it says in the survey question, or is the survey question bias? Explain. So the first one says, do you think farmers should use poison to control insects on crops? In this case, there is bias because they are using a certain type of language that would lead to a strong reaction. And that language that they're using is they're saying poison. Instead of just saying, a pesticide, they're saying poison. So that causes it to be biased. The second one says, don't you agree that most child care workers are underpaid? This one also shows bias because the don't you agree, first of all, that's a double negative, but then it's also, it's a leading question. It's leading you to agree that most child care workers are underpaid. And then the last question says, do you think teachers should communicate frequently with students and their parents about class grades? In this case, even though it may not seem like it, but there is bias here because they are asking, should teachers communicate frequently with students and their parents about class grades? So it's the fact that it's students and then it's also parents. If you just asked about one versus the other or asked in two separate questions, then it would not be considered a biased question. All right, so in try two, it says, is a survey question biased? Explain. So it says, do you think the cafeteria food is nutritional and tasty? Again, this one is biased because it's asking, first of all, about two separate questions. And then on top of that, it's kind of leading you because it's using, it's kind of giving you a strong reaction with tasty. And then the second one says, how would you rate the performance of the highly effective student council? And once again, this is biased based on the language. You're saying highly effective. So they're already leading you to think that that student council is highly effective. Instead of just saying, how would you rate the performance of the student council, they added in the adjectives highly effective, and that makes it biased. All right, last, example 3 is designing a survey. So it says, during the 2008 Olympic Games, a U.S. swimmer won more gold medals than any Olympic swimmer before. What sampling method could you use to find the percent of students who recognize that swimmer from a photo? What is a survey question that is likely to yield unbiased information? So a sampling method that you could use based on the 4 that we have before us. So remember, there's convenience, self-selected, systemic, and random. I think the best sampling method that we could use here is a random sample. So if you ask students in the school randomly throughout the day, that may be the best way to kind of get that about. You can just ask students randomly in the hallway. It doesn't really matter. Or, you could also use a systemic. It may actually also be convenience. Systemic. because it may be VNIENCE. Sorry. You can ask, like, for example, every 10th person that enters the building. Okay, so it's convenience because they're all entering the building. You're just standing there, but it's systemic because you're asking every 10th person. Okay, so even then it says, what is a survey question that is likely to yield unbiased information? And you could simply say, who is pictured in this photograph? Or even more simple, who is this? Okay, so that's a very unbiased question, and we've chosen 2 different ways, or somewhat 3 different ways of sampling to get the results that we're hoping for, which is unbiased sample. All right, so then in try 3, it says, what sampling method could you use to find the percent of residents in your neighborhood who recognize the governor of your state by name? What is a survey question that is likely to yield unbiased information? So again, with this method, you may want to consider, I wouldn't necessarily consider a convenience one here, but I would probably do systemic, maybe every other house. You could ask every other house in your neighborhood, or every other house, doesn't really matter, because that kind of makes it random, but it's also systemic. And then an unbiased question, once again, is you could say, you could have, for example, 4 pictures, and of those 4 pictures, you can ask, who is the governor? Or another way is you could also have the picture of the person and once again say, who is this? So there are a couple different ways you can do that, but really it's all up to you. All right, guys, remember, if you have any questions, be sure to come see me for tutoring.